Hello and welcome to the first installment of The Lincoln Journey. I'm your host, Grant Veeder. If you followed me here from Facebook, you know that I've been posting stories about Lincoln's life there. I've been a big Lincoln fan since my college days at the University of Northern Iowa. Much later, I managed to get a spot on the Iowa Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. At that time, I started giving presentations around the state, first about Lincoln's connections to the state of Iowa, and then on other aspects of Lincoln's life and career. I wrote articles about Lincoln that were published in a couple of magazines, and a year or so ago I wrote a couple of things about Lincoln on Facebook and unexpectedly found an audience that encouraged me to write more and to present my stories elsewhere. So here I am. So where should we begin? Well, the beginning is a good place to begin, but I think we'll start at the end. I think I can make a good case for starting there, but the plain fact is that I already wrote on Facebook a pretty long story in a fashion that is close to how I wanted to present it in this program. So let's begin with a story of Lincoln's assassination entitled The Conspirators. I'm recording this episode on April 20th. On this date in 1865, 6 days after he shot Abraham Lincoln to death in Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth was still at large, on the run with accomplice Davey Herold in southern Maryland. But he was nearing the end of his flight, the end of his freedom, and the end of his life. What started Booth on this doomed path, which now found him, as he wrote, wet, cold, and starving, with every man's hand against him, rather than enjoying the hero's plaudits that he had expected? Booth just wanted to save the country that he loved. It was a very different country than we know now. Before the Civil War, the United States was dominated politically by pro-slavery forces. The leaders of the slave power sensed in the election of Abraham Lincoln that the control that they had held since the birth of the Republic was seriously threatened. So they attempted to break away and form a new nation. Booth fervently believed in the Southern way of life, and he wanted to be a patriot. He had reached a point where he felt compelled to accomplish a dramatic act that would have a significant effect on the outcome of the war between the North and the South. The act that he had in mind, however, was not, at the start, the assassination of the U.S. president. Instead, Booth was making plans to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. To discern his reason for doing so, we will briefly synopsize a particular aspect of the American Civil War. In the first 2 years of the war, 1861 to 63, the two sides were fighting to a draw, more or less. Time and again, the Confederate Army in the Eastern Theater prevented the Union forces from gaining the initiative. In the West, the Union gradually gained ground, but progress was slow and costly. However, the North's advantage in population and resources was never in question. In a drawn-out war of attrition, the South's reserves of men, food, and weaponry would be exhausted long before the North's. In the second half of the war, this advantage focused attention on the hundreds of thousands of soldiers held by both sides as prisoners of war. Initially, prisoner exchanges were common, and returning these troops to the battlefield favored the less populous South. But on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation not only declared that all slaves in areas controlled by the Confederacy were free, it also approved accepting freed slaves and other free blacks into the U.S. Armed Forces. The South rejected both of these fiats, so whenever black soldiers were captured, the rebels would not include them in prisoner exchanges. The North objected, and the exchange system broke down. Southern prisoners in Northern prison camps thus became more and more valuable as a factor in the war, and attempts were made to free them so that they could fight once again for the Confederacy. The prisoner of war angle is what got John Wilkes Booth thinking about kidnapping Lincoln. He assumed that the North would set free its Confederate prisoners in exchange for the release of the president. Capturing the President of the United States and safely conveying him into Confederate lines couldn't reasonably be accomplished alone. In mid-1864, Booth started talking to friends about working out a detailed plot. The unlikely success of such a plan would owe much to the fact that the District of Columbia was completely hemmed in by slave states Virginia, which seceded in 1861 and joined the Confederacy, and Maryland, which did not secede. Even within the district, slaveholding was legal until April of 1862. Therefore, the area was saturated with pro-slavery, pro-Confederate sentiment. Booth needed to actively engage some of the citizenry and to count on the sympathy of the rest. He was able to find a fair number of willing accomplices who agreed with him that they were entirely justified in helping the South win the war with a kidnapping. Now, it's no surprise to us that Booth changed his plan from a kidnapping to murder, but it came as an unpleasant shock to some of his co-conspirators. More on them later. By 1864, the tide of war was turning against the South. General Ulysses S. Grant's campaign that summer against Robert E. Lee incurred such fearful Union casualties that many at the North, including First Lady Mary Lincoln, referred to Grant as a butcher. But Lee's armies suffered serious losses too. As previously noted, the North could replace its dead, wounded, and missing, while the South's manpower had been severely depleted. John Wilkes Booth, who was born near Baltimore in 1838, had spent most of the war up until this point as an increasingly successful tragedian. His father, English immigrant Junius Booth, was at the time of his 1852 death the premier performer on the American stage. Booth's older brothers, Junius Jr. and Edwin, were already established actors. The dashingly handsome John seemed to be in the process of eclipsing their fame when his acting career all but ground to a halt as he started canceling engagements in the second half of 1864. In May, at the end of the regular theater season, he went to western Pennsylvania to engage in oil drilling speculation, but he spent much of September divesting himself of his interest there. What seems to have happened in between is that he took it into his head to kidnap President Lincoln. Why would he come up with such a harebrained scheme? It probably wasn't an original idea. In 1864, there were at least a couple of other plans to abduct Lincoln. One of them was part of General Jubal Early's campaign through Maryland in July, an attack that brought the rebels to the outskirts of Washington. As recounted in Michael Kaufman's American Brutus, Colonel Bradley Tyler Johnson conceived of the idea of taking Lincoln to Richmond as a prisoner of war should Early's attack prove successful. In an 1889 Journal article called My Ride Around Baltimore in 1864, Johnson described his plan and how it was commandeered by General Early, who sent Johnson on a futile side mission to liberate 12,000 Confederate POWs in a South Maryland prison camp. For his part, Lincoln went to observe the action between Early and the Federals at Fort Stevens, north of Washington, becoming the first and only wartime president to come under enemy fire during the president's term. Significantly, it was reported that on his second trip to the fort in as many days, the carriage that conveyed him there with his wife Mary arrived well in advance of its cavalry escort. This is an important note because other plans, including Booth's, contemplated capturing Booth en route between the White House and the cottage on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home, 3.5 miles to the north, where the Lincolns retreated in summer and autumn to escape the steamy cauldron of Washington. President James Buchanan was the first president to take advantage of the cottages on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home, a residence for disabled veterans. The Lincolns planned to go there in the summer of 1861, but when the nation descended into civil war, their plans were postponed. The next 3 years, they would move out there in mid to late June and return to the White House in late October or early November. Mary would sometimes spend weeks vacationing in the northeastern United States, but Lincoln seldom slept elsewhere during those months. But he would commute daily to work at the White House, either riding horseback or by carriage. At first, he would ride alone or with a few companions, resisting concerns about his safety, but he was finally convinced to allow himself to be accompanied by a cavalry escort. However, he would still travel without them from time to time, sometimes late at night, or, as in his July 1864 visit to Fort Stevens, he would be temporarily separated from them. His daily journey, some of it in fairly remote areas, varied little and was well known to the public. Thomas Nelson Conrad claimed in his post-war memoir, A Confederate Spy, that he formulated a kidnap plan with the approval of Confederate War Department. Based on his surveillance of the president's travels, he and his team set the plan in motion sometime in the fall of 1864. But at the critical moment, he found Lincoln to be surrounded by a cavalry troop. Michael Kaufman accepts Conrad's story, but Matthew Pinsker, in Lincoln's Sanctuary, of Abraham Lincoln and the Soldiers' Home, is more dubious, given Conrad's inaccurate assertion that this was the first time Lincoln traveled with protection. More widely accepted is the report that one night in August 1864, Lincoln arrived at the Soldiers' Home hatless, shortly after a guard heard a rifle shot. Lincoln brushed it off as a careless discharge that startled his horse, causing his stovepipe hat to topple off as the horse bolted to their destination. The next morning, the hat was found with a bullet hole through it. However Booth conceived of his plot, he revealed it in Baltimore to some childhood friends with whom he had become reacquainted. Also that August, Sam Arnold and Mike O'Loughlin had never met each other before, but they found they had both served in the same Confederate regiment earlier in the war. According to Arnold's memoirs, the two were impressed with Booth's celebrity and magnetic personality and agreed to help Booth execute his plan to overtake the president's carriage, handcuff him, and spear him through Maryland to Virginia. Lincoln would be held hostage until the Union agreed to resume the prisoner exchange. Though the plan sounds implausible, it apparently wasn't considered illegal. The U.S. Army's Guide to the Laws of War recognized the legality of hostage-taking. Now, whether the Union government would accept the Confederate interpretation in this case was not tested, which raises the question, how involved were Confederate officials and their agents with John Wilkes Booth? After Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, and all through the trial of the accused assassins, which ended on June 30th of that year, the official stance of the U.S. government was that Booth and his co-conspirators were acting at the behest of the rebel government. Booth himself would strongly insinuate to his crew that he had official sanction from Richmond. He spent considerable time in the months before his attack in Montreal, Canada, and New York City, both of which were centers of Confederate espionage. He undoubtedly consorted with spies and couriers. But he was a practiced liar who liked to give himself a fearsome reputation and an aura of consequence, possibly to compensate for not enlisting in the Confederate Army. He had promised his mother that he wouldn't. So while his star power opened doors for him both north and south in many social, official, and secret settings, he probably found it better suited to his purposes to make people think he was working for the Confederacy, rather than to actually have to take orders from a Confederate master. No positive proof has been discovered, aside from some perjured testimony, to link Booth to the Confederate government. However, Booth may have been close enough to inner circles to hear about kidnapping plans, perhaps specifically ones that envisioned a stand-and-deliver moment some dark night on the 7th Street Turnpike north of the Capitol. Or he may have heard it from someone in Bradley Johnson's command, which included friends of Mike O'Loughlin from Booth's old Baltimore neighborhood. After bringing O'Loughlin and Sam Arnold into his scheme, Booth headed back to the Pennsylvania oil fields, but he kept the idea alive by sending Arnold $20 and asking him to find a good saddle horse. In October, he was several days in Montreal, where he may or may not have talked to Confederate officials operating from there, but he did spend considerable time with the family of a blockade runner, Patrick C. Martin. Martin wrote Booth a letter of introduction to Dr. William Queen in Charles County, southern Maryland. The letter, described by Dr. Queen's son-in-law at the assassination trial, is an early indicator that Booth's plan was more than just talk. On November 12th, he showed up at Dr. Queen's house in Maryland, asking about real estate prospects. This was a ruse to familiarize himself with the area. Two very active Confederate courier routes ran south from Washington through Maryland to where the Potomac River broadens out, making it difficult to catch smugglers going to and from Virginia. Booth needed to know the lay of the land and to recruit accomplices who not only knew the area but were accustomed to traveling through it without arousing the authorities. Because of the smuggling and the spy operations on this peninsula lying alongside the northern neck of Virginia, Union patrols impeded freedom of movement there, but they never completely shut down the shady operations, both because of the ubiquity of Southern sympathy and because Northern infiltrators used the courier routes to plant spies in Richmond and elsewhere. Sometime in the fall of 1864, Booth met John Surratt, the Surratt who got away. The 20-year-old Confederate courier was a key find for Booth. Not only did he travel regularly between Richmond and Montreal, delivering messages hidden in his boot heel or between the planks of his buggy, but a tavern located conveniently along a courier route belonged to his mother, Mary, the Surratt who didn't get away. At first, John Surratt thought Booth's plan to be folly, but after 2 days' reflection, he decided it was solid enough to risk. We know his experience as a courier gave him a low opinion of federal forces. As he told a lecture audience some years later, "I confess that never in my life did I come across a more stupid set of detectives than those generally employed by the United States government." Next time we'll learn more about Booth's plan and the challenges that forced him to revise it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me at grantveeder@gmail.com. Before I go, I want to thank the City of Waterloo and more particularly Ed Stover and Agnes Kress of Waterloo Public Television for providing this service to amateurs like me. It is much appreciated. I hope all of you enjoyed this look into the life and times of Abraham Lincoln and that you'll join us next time for The Conspirators Part 2.